Hey there, this is Greg. It's been a long time since I've published a video. This one's going to be a short one. I'm just going to show you something really cool today on how you can use custom metrics inside of ThingWorx to do specific application-related performance metric tracking using built-in functionalities and have those tied out to Prometheus and to Grafana to create something along these lines where I'm looking at different aspects of file transfers. Note that I did not use this technique to create this dashboard, but it's an example of some very key application level functionality that we might want to have some high level visibility based on whatever our solution is doing and getting into some specifics. So let's have a look. Typical things are things like errors, things like counters, things like durations. You know, how long are these executions taking? And so I wanted to have a look to see if I could leverage this internal system resource here that's under resources, metric services, and metric services has a number of services that come included with it, and they've been there for a number of years actually. Some of them have been added over the past sort of year. Get latency metrics is one that's going to tell us latency metrics to the backend database, for example, which can be quite helpful. And there's some other ones in here, like persistence provider metrics is going to tell us about our different ThingWorx provider connections, how many connections they have, if there's any failed idle tests, things like this. So there's some useful things in here, but what we're going to look at today specifically are the custom metric functions, and we're mostly going to talk about counter and gauge type metrics, right? Gauge type metrics are things like CPU percentage, right? That's something that's changing. It's going from one value to another value, but it's always going to be read at the moment of time, right? So it's only relevant that it's always updated with a new value, hence like CPU or disk space, right? Disk space, it's a question of absolute moment in time. How much disk space do I have free right now? That's a gauge metric. A counter metric is something that's happening over time, like how many requests have there been. I'm always incrementing, you know, if there's a request, I'm incrementing one to the request counter. It is constantly going up. And then the question is, what is the rate that it is going up, and by what is the amount? So the amount that it might be going up could be something like a duration. If we're trying to time the overall service execution, we might want to set a timer at the beginning of the service execution and one at the end. Subtract the two of those to understand the overall service execution time, and then we can use that value in milliseconds or seconds to apply a particular counter, to increment a counter by that value that's going to tell us our overall execution time. And you might have seen that one used, Tomcat. If we look at the Tomcat dashboard here, I use that kind of approach here with the Tomcat metrics, where Tomcat exposes the request count and they also expose the processing time. So this is the total time that Tomcat spends processing requests. So if you divide the two by each other, then you get kind of an average on time being spent executing those requests. So keep that in mind right here. This is looking at requests. This is a request rate, but this is coming from a counter for Tomcat. So if we get rid of the rate here, we'll see what this looks like. Looks horrible with that one. There we go. So there's the request count for a Tomcat. It's constantly increasing, and then we're using some, you know, PromQL things to make it relevant for us. But this is essentially what we're going for. And from a creativity perspective, think about your application and how you might apply some of those things to how your application is running. And let's come back over to ThingWorx now and note a couple of these services. So here we have decrement counter metric. I don't really see any use for this. We typically only increment counters, but there is a function to decrement a counter, so you might want to use that for kind of clever thread-safe mechanisms, because this is using Java APIs in a synchronized fashion inside of the JVM, so this will also be a thread-safe mechanism to build a counter. And then we've got get counter metrics, so this is going to pull the counter back for us, and we just need to provide the key. And we've got get gauge metric, which is going to get it back for us. And we have increment counter metric, and we have set gauge metric. So set gauge metric, going to take the key, going to take the base type of the metric, the value that we want to set the gauge to, and aggregate. Aggregate is used if we want to aggregate this metric across the cluster. Typically, we don't ever want to do that because performance metrics should really be cluster local. But I did just actually have a situation where I did create this to be a cluster level metric, and that means that the metric's going to be set and stored at the cluster level. So there's going to be, you know, more update and more cluster level traffic to do that level of metrics. But that might be relevant where you're looking at something that's happening across the overall cluster. And I was specifically looking at something where the trigger was coming from one node, but I wanted to make sure that all nodes had access to that metric so that they could pull it back from the other nodes. Okay, so in application, what might this look like? Here I've created a gauge service. This is just a really basic one. Execute the service, and we're going to use this metric service set gauge metric. Pass in a base type of number. If it's a counter, you're going to want to use long so that we can get you know, largest possible counter numbers. And here I'm just incrementing. I'm setting the value to 12, and then here I'm prefacing it with this key underscore underscore PTC underscore reported. And that's actually the trick to this this neat little approach, is that this is an internally used key that is going to go through the internal performance metrics that exist in memory. And if it sees any keys that start with this, it's going to expose those when it's exporting on the Prometheus endpoint. So you can see here, I just kind of faked a thread count, imagining that we've built some code that's doing a number of you know, concurrent multi-threaded requests over to an MES. And you know, we can see those if we come over here on the metrics endpoint, the open metrics endpoint here. We can see that this comes in as ThingWorx underscore general underscore underscore underscore, so 3 underscores, PTC underscore reported dot, well, underscore integration underscore MES underscore thread count, and those are 12. So that's pretty slick, frankly, because this gives us the possibility to essentially enhance what is the native ThingWorx metrics and monitoring that's going to just become exposed. That we typically pull metrics using Prometheus out. We can really quickly, you know, with a few lines of code, we can really quickly add some custom application specific metrics to that. I was going to do a quick demo, try to tie this to Kepware. I guess we can give it a try. But basically, that's just going to come in on ThingWorx. I think I'm going to stop there because, I mean, it's just going to come in on ThingWorx, right? We just, sorry, on Prometheus, we see this metric here. Maybe let's just do a quick little test, right? So we're going to copy this. I'm not going to wire this together. The idea was I was going to wire it together to make some random changing values, but it's somewhat pointless. We're going to take this particular value. Let's come back over to here, and you know, imagine that we go to our foundation. Not actually sure if this one's working here on this environment. It seems to be. Okay, so we're going to just create a quick kind of trash area in here. Trash. We're going to pop a, oops, I already did that, visualization in there. And we're going to take that thread count. I think the other one, I can't remember what the other one I called it was, but if I just erase that, here we can see there's 2 of them that match this pattern, and there's this request count. So I'm actually more interested in this request count. So we're going to pop that up there, and let's go ahead and rename this to something else like MES request count. And this should be, this is incrementing, right? So this is, I'm not going to use a rate. Normally I'd always use a rate here, but I'm going to use the increase just to make this obvious. Increase. We need a range, so we're going to use rate interval here, and let's put that around there. Okay, so there we're down at 0, right? So we have 0 because that counter value is not changing. And let's just set this to like a 30-second auto refresh. And let's come back to our ThingWorx over here, come into the counter. So here you can see I've got, I'm going to add 1 to this counter, request count. So let's just execute this a couple times. Um, 30 seconds is pretty good. And here we're going to, normally a counter you're only executing it by ones, but as I mentioned, there are certain use cases like with a duration you might want to execute with larger numbers. So let's pretend this is a duration and we're executing by 15. And here, go back to 1. There we go. So my Prometheus is scraping only every 30 seconds, so it's going to take a little bit of time for us to see those changes come in. But we do see the spike going up. And so, as I say, just try to think of this creatively. You know, what kinds of system integrations might I be doing? What kinds of gauge values might I want to know? Like how many of my assets that I have online that, you know, remote things are typically something that we're going to look at down here in the connected AWS communication, where we have active WebSockets, where they're going to tell us about how many WebSockets are there, how many bound connected things, but you might have bound connected things that are more than your actual asset park that you want to have different visibility. That's why I've added this reporting things over here. But you know, the sky's kind of the limit if you can make your own metrics, what you might want to do with them.